One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Daniel from the YouTube channel called Anarchy to discuss the topic of, well, you guessed it, anarchism. I am not an anarchist myself, but as I've said on the show before, we want to discuss various different perspectives politically, and I think it has become ever more important to actually understand what anarchism is and the anarchist positions on things from a person who is an actual well-educated anarchist. And it's very easy these days to kind of dismiss anarchists by, taking a Twitter anarchist or a teenage anarchist who, is just going through a phase or says some very ill-informed, premature stuff. And it's easy to take that as a sort of straw man to attack, because let's face it, I mean, those anarchists do exist, but I don't think it's a very valid reason to dismiss all of anarchism based on that, in the same way that it would be silly to dismiss Marxism based on a guy on Twitter with a Stalin avatar. I've familiarized myself with quite a lot of anarchist content lately, and I will say you have some like really well thought out content. Like you're doing the tasks that not just people on the anarchist side don't do enough of, but people in general on the left, they don't actually, think of what the alternative will look like and how to get there. And you have very in-depth stuff on how all of that could work or the problems associated with that. So in other words, you're thinking about the hard questions, and I think that's what we need to be doing. So this will be a very interesting discussion. There's a lot of questions I want to ask, and I think you're well up to the task to answer them, given what I've seen from your videos. But without further ado, would you like to introduce yourself, Daniel, and anything I missed?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be on here. Yeah, so my YouTube channel is Anarchy. My name is Daniel. I make videos which cover theory pretty in depth, but I also have a pretty significant focus on practice. This is partially due to the fact that after reading history, I can see how many things have gone wrong. And so obviously we're going to need to revise the things that have been done in the past, but also because I've been organizing for, I don't know, since 2011, so about 13 years now. So I have some experience actually doing things on the ground. I know what it looks like to actually act and organize people towards action. But yeah, no, I love having discussions just like this. So I'm looking forward to whatever questions you've got.
Yeah, part of who made this happen, I want to give credit to Marlowe from Moneyless Society, Zachary Marlowe. He's been on, we've had various discussions on One Dime Radio before, and he's also a very creative thinker interested in, the practicalities. I mean, what alternative do we want? And I think it's worth, looking at the differences between different tendencies on the left rather than this sort of naive approach of let's just not deal with any of that. Let's all unite in some united front and deal with that after. I feel like that's a kind of cover, for people under some sort of project, whether that be shoehorning them into like a Democratic Party or something, or a Leninist project. And, speaking of that, there's a lot of bad critiques I've seen of anarchism. I'm not an anarchist, and we'll get into some of my critiques, but there's a tendency for people to say, look, Friedrich Engels and his 3-page pamphlet on authority, he destroyed anarchism. What's there to critique? Let's let you say, what's the problem with citing Engels' on authority as a
They're bringing it up.
anarchist? and in general, the
out
accusation
the
of
door.
authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think that On Authority is a very weak essay. It reads to me, like in its historical context, as Engels being very emotionally charged. It's very knee-jerk. It's very reactive.
Damn.
It doesn't have a very in-depth analysis. It's kind of this scattershot approach where he just makes every argument he can think of, and none of them really land because I don't think Engels actually had a very good understanding of what anarchists actually believed. And I think that is generally a flaw of authoritarian leftists in general, is they actually have no idea what anarchists believe or have believed throughout history, the different varieties of anarchism, the different ways of conceptualizing change, as well as how political power structures work. So I think the main issue with the essay on authority is that Engels really just makes authority mean anything and everything he needs it to be in the moment. You know, for him, authority is force. Authority is any form of imposition. Authority is necessity. He says that steam is authority. Steam in machines, driving forth the machines is a form of authority. And I think that when we've broadened out this term such that it now applies to physical processes, we've pretty much completely lost the subject of our analysis. Anarchists, when they're talking about authority, they're talking about the form of political power structures. So we're talking about, historically, the way it was phrased is structures based on domination, where there are those above and there are those below. There are those that are compelled to obey by these structures of domination, structures of authority. And those in positions of authority are generally going to be a very small group of people which impose their will upon the masses through violence, threat, and coercion, as well as deception. Me, I generally take an approach to understanding authority is concentration of power. It's basically things are more and more authoritarian as you are making fewer and fewer people make decisions, and those fewer and fewer people making decisions that affect larger and larger groups of people. So, you might imagine that in society we have power that is circulating. People have different abilities. They can do different things. We have all this power circulating. And authoritarianism is when more and more of that naturally circulating power is directed by a smaller and smaller group of people. And so that is, to a large degree, what anarchists are actually objecting to. And I believe, and anarchists historically believe, that the more that this centralization of power and the direction of power decision making is centralized or concentrated in the hands of very few people, then you just get domination. You just get subjugation of the masses. As you are sort of divorced from the ability to make decisions about the world around you, you are more and more at the whim of the decisions of a very small group of people.
Yeah, I think Engels is responding to a lot of the critics historically who would critique the French Revolution, for example, and the violence. And he's responding to people who are kind of just opposed to revolution, and he seems to conflate, revolutionary violence as such with authoritarianism, in his famous quote when he says, "Revolution is the most authoritarian thing ever." And, like you said, the thing with authoritarianism, it's more to do with the concentration of power. A thing is more authoritarian, not based on, if it's more violent or does more bad things. It's more authoritarian the more that authority is concentrated in a few hands, right? And, this is why I think a lot of these lazy kind of arguments are enabled by, lazy liberal imperialists. Let's be honest. Because, there's this whole tendency of liberals who will say, will defend America, which is, one of the most authoritarian states, authoritarian empires ever, They'll defend that, and then they'll say, oh, China, Russia, that's when authoritarianism is a problem. But when we do it, it's fine. And I think that kind of enables, the people who want to defend projects like the Soviet Union or just, maybe even the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. They'll kind of say, well, look at this hypocrisy. See, it doesn't really matter, does it? Authoritarianism doesn't really mean anything. And I kind of think, that's kind of silly. Even Mao was Mao thought the party was getting too authoritarian. There's a kind of awareness after the fact, or even Lenin right before he dies, and when he writes "Better, Fewer, but Better," when he says, the state we created is rotten and decrepit. The state is not that much different from the czarist state. He goes out and says that. Like, so to
How
use
come
that
we don't
argument, I
talk
feel
about
like it's
that?
just so lazy. It's also not even a good rebuttal of the classical liberal critique of authoritarianism, which
Is Lenin criticizing the motherland? Holy shit.
would be that, the way to prevent the sort of tyranny that you would see in absolute monarchy, you need a kind of separation of powers. You need to have authorities be elected
How the mighty
and
have
circulated
fallen.
and be able to be thrown out. Now, of course, the kind of democracy we end up getting out of bourgeois democracy is highly limited. The people participation is limited, and the central authority is greatly enhanced. I mean, if you just read the Federalist Papers and look what Hamilton and Madison say about the president's basically an elected monarch. That's what they are. But yeah, I think that's worth establishing, just because when we get into this discussion more in our differences, like, I think it's worth kind of getting that out of the way, because I feel like, I'm tired of that being a kind of lazy argument, because then to me, that's like burying the question. Oh, if we don't have to deal with authoritarianism, then it's not even a problem we should think about. And it's like, how are you going to prevent the likes of a Stalin or, the abuse of power? It seems very lazy to me. It's kind of a little bit like the way Lenin also himself, I think. I do place a lot of blame at Lenin and kind of paving this road. Because Lenin, in State and Revolution, which is his most like anti-state text, even in that text, he says freedom and the state can't coexist, which is an anarchist kind of position, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like the way he uses that is he kind of says, well, freedom's a question that will, you can't really have true freedom with the state anyway, and we need the state. So forget about the whole like freedom discussion. Let's just bury that. And I feel like that, even though Lenin, would probably be rolling in his grave seeing what USSR became, I mean, that paved the way, in my view, for totalitarianism. When you can have like a complete, there's no line at which you draw this expansion of the state's authority. So yeah, it's worth getting into that. But yeah, maybe where we disagree, I just noticed where immediately when you were talking, you said authoritarian leftists. See, to me, that is a kind of a bit of a obfuscating label, because
Yeah, it is.
you would probably say all leftists are authoritarian if they believe in the state, I think. And I don't know, the way I see it more is authoritarianism is like a sort of spectrum. There's some degree that I think might be inevitable or necessary, and some, you can try to avoid it at some scales. I think anarchists are like, in a true sense, kind of anti-authoritarian. But
Yeah.
I see it as a spectrum, just because, like, I don't know, I take from a more practical perspective. Like, I think we should recognize and try to mitigate it. But you kind of use the word authoritarian leftist, and I can already imagine people listening are kind of, they hate it, they feel called out. I feel called out because it's like, am I authoritarian leftist? I guess, but I don't know. I don't see myself that way.
You don't want to be.
I would
We
agree
shouldn't
with
want
you
to be.
that it is a spectrum. That being said, I do think there's kind of a breakover point. In my mind, the breakover point is there at like supporting hierarchical power structures. The state is one of many hierarchical power structures, and in general, it is the one that leftists are most likely to support. They're more generally opposed to almost every kind of power structure, but the state gets a pass, and it's not meant to be an insult. It's meant to be an observation. So, I think that, yes, the state is an authoritarian structure. It does that very concentration of power that we discussed. There, of course, we could have a discussion about the definition of the state. Obviously, this is just where it almost always goes in a discussion between anarchists and Marxists is the definition of the state. But yeah, no, in my mind, that is definitely the key marker. Is there an open support for any form of hierarchical power structure? If the answer is yes, I would say that places somebody within the realm of authoritarianism. And on the left, the state is a hierarchical power structure. So I think there are a variety of, say, Marxists, for example, that I wouldn't consider authoritarian leftists. There are libertarian socialist Marxists, mostly because if you get into the fiddly details of what they mean by a state, they believe that a proletarian state could literally be controlled by masses of local councils, very similar to what an anarchist might suggest. And in that case, I wouldn't consider them an authoritarian leftist, even if they said they supported the state, because what they mean by the state is just
Collective
controlled
action.
by the masses, which is pretty
Yeah,
much the
yeah.
negation of the state in anarchist
Yes.
conceptions.
Or how would you feel about like just democratic states? Because like even Marx, for example, in the
Then
Paris
it's
writings on the Paris Commune,
not a
he
bottom up.
supports a form of representative democracy in which representatives are immediately recallable.
Democracy is not a bottom up power structure.
And there's also instruction, which seems like some crazy idea, right? But like this kind of democracy did exist in some of the American states in the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution created the Federated Republic, and like in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, albeit kind of just for white men basically, but it was like a form of representative democracy in which you could recall, in which there was assemblies. I don't know. Would you consider like that still like authoritarian?
Yeah, I think that representation is at the center of how the state does authoritarianism. So I think that it's really important to kind of make distinctions between this concept of representation and delegation. So representation is baked into the structure. You have to vote for a representative. You just choose between available representatives. What the anarchists want is, you might say, kind of the sandbox style instead. Everything defaults, it roots to the local councils. We don't have to vote for any representatives unless we feel that it is somehow necessary to delegate somebody to do a task. There's no baked in structure where we have to vote for a representative. So think about it this way. In a representative structure, if I choose to revoke a representative, I can't just say, cool, now no more representatives, we're just going to make the decisions directly. I have to just choose a different representative now. Whereas in an anarchist system, if I revoke a delegate, there is no necessity for me to elect another delegate. That doesn't have to be done. The councils themselves can directly, democratically make those decisions. And all that power that they delegate always roots back to that council. So they can completely deconstruct any system that they've put into place at their whim. And I think that's one of the distinguishing factors between the state structure and what anarchists are advocating, is that difference between representation, which is structurally locked, is how I've often referred to it, and delegation, which is, this sort of open structure where we can choose delegates or we can choose to make those decisions on our own.
The way I do see representative democracy with recall and instruction, though, is a way to kind of have representation be more like, to essentially be like democratic in the furthest sense that it can be at the level of representation. And I see representation as just kind of, for me, I see it as inevitable in the sense that the larger of a polity you have, the harder it's going to be to have like direct participation. So representation is just a kind of way to easily, pick from the public. But if you have no monopoly on power, like in the way that there's no way to, like, no one has absolute power. I see that still as fundamentally democratic. And if you exclude means of, I think the purest way to have it democratic would be sortition, which I don't think you would oppose, right? I feel like you'd probably support some kind of sortition, but like, if someone is skeptical of that, right? Like, let's say you even had party democracy, but the representatives are still recallable. I still think that it's not quite locked in that way, you might say. There's still like a way for people to fundamentally hold them accountable,
I would say it's still structurally locked. I still have to choose a representative. We can't just, devolve the decision making back down into local councils. And I think that's a really important distinction between delegation and representation. I should also note that, those measures have already been put in place in various places on Earth. You look at, for example, Sweden. Sweden has a very democratic system. It's sort of a mixture between representation and local council democracy. So they have like means of local councils helping make decisions, but they still vote for their representatives and they can recall them. But one might notice that, Sweden's still backsliding, right? So Sweden's still now backsliding into fascism. And in fact, they actually have an ascendant fascist party in their parliament. Should also note Canada, for example. Canada actually has recalls. You can do recalls of the representatives.
We don't. We don't have recalls. We don't.
Oh, okay. Well, somebody had told me that at one point. I thought I looked it up.
Yeah, I definitely don't. I would say so, but you're right about Sweden, and Switzerland also kind of works like that. Plus, they have another, they have referendums as well and all that. No, I would say Canada is among one of the least democratic bourgeois democracies, actually. In some regards, even less than the U.S. It's less totalitarian in the sense that there's less of a state apparatus that can spy on you and send stormtroopers your way. But Canada, you vote for the party representative once and that's it. You're stuck for 4 years. And the representative just votes with the prime minister. It really sucks.
Right. Yeah, but I guess the point I'm getting across here is that these systems have already been instituted within the representative systems that we have, right? We've already seen what it looks like when they're implemented. And what we see is that the concentration of power just still leads to all of the sort of perverse incentives and disincentives that we might expect from any old bourgeois democracy. And I don't really have any personal confidence that in a post-revolutionary society that this is going to go different, that these power dynamics are going to fundamentally change in any fundamental manner. I think that we've already kind of seen what it looks like for those to be instituted and that it produces a superior society, but it doesn't necessarily produce a revolutionary society. I think the only way you're really going to get a revolutionary society is by having this sort of system where all power defaults back to the local councils, where they form the mandates completely from those councils. So, one of the problems here is that the mandate, once again, for these representatives is baked into the structure of the system. They get to decide all the legislation. They're the ones that get to decide regulation. They're the ones that pass all of these, different legal, structural aspects of the system. We don't get any control over that except through these rare ballot measures that take place. Whereas in an anarchist system, it might be that we realize, hey, we just can't always be deciding on every single one of these details. We might need somebody to pay close attention to, I don't know, energy infrastructure. And, I don't want to have to vote every single time they're going to put up a new power line. That's just not necessary. So we would delegate somebody to, handle the power infrastructure. And if we did not like the way that they dealt with it, sorry, I have a kitten that is literally climbing all over my legs right now. If we did not like the way that they were dealing with it, we could revoke them, put a new delegate in place, or we could say, hey, actually, we're realizing that these delegates are making a lot of decisions we don't agree with. We're just going to get rid of that delegate structure, and we're going to go back to making decisions about that energy infrastructure within the councils. The mandates for everybody that is put into a sort of administrative or expert position where they have some form of in the moment decision making, that's always determined by the local councils. I think this is the only way that you get an actual transformation of decision making in society, while still maintaining this capability to develop compartments, to empower experts to make decisions on the spot. Because obviously that is one of the main objections to a horizontal system.
And
I think you're correct that
the snow's out of
would
control
allow for more empowerment of individuals and influence in
wide
society.
awake,
But
so
your argument you sort of made about Sweden and
I'm wide awake. Oh yeah, and I saw that Anarchy did this video or did this interview with One Time, and they're just talking about the differences and the things and the controversy of anarchism versus Marxism. And it's interesting to hear a respectful dialogue being exchanged in this subject,
and systems that have more.
And it's interesting how the very first thing they open up with is the on authority argument. And even One Time's just like, yeah, Lenin even said, look what our fucking state has become. It is now just as bad as the czars. And this is criticism of USSR. And it's like, damn. I mean, they're just like, I'm just like, how come that's never a discussion? but oh yeah. Yeah, well, that's kind of it. Is they're kind of dwindling down the concepts of, you know, what authority means, and how both have kind of like transmissed their own definition to fit their own way. But it's like, you know, under the anarchist perspective of you know, centering power structures rather than diversifying them is kind of the difference. And they're just kind of, you know, it's, I mean, so far 23 minutes in, I'm loving this. This is actually really really cool dialogue.
Or democratic representation, you seem to judge them a lot by their outcomes, like, you know, saying Sweden's backsliding. I assume you mean kind of embracing neoliberalism to an extent, as well as, you know, xenophobia, anti-immigrant policies. Now, especially with that latter case, it's not clear to me that that would especially with the anti-immigrant stuff, that would not happen under an anarchist system. Because, I mean, if you have, like,
right.
If the assumption of democracy is like you do what people want, right? And this is actually something I worry a little bit about direct democracy, in fact, is, you know, to what extent do people actually just want like xenophobic policies sometimes? Like in the case of Sweden, it's a highly homogenous society, very difficult to adapt to, very difficult language to learn. It's a country that fundamentally, you know, doesn't handle immigration as well as like the likes of Canada, US, UK. And, you know, that's the thing, you know, Zizek has mentioned this point before, you know, when talking about direct democracy, is that, you know, what if people just decide to throw the immigrants out? I mean, that's not impossible. And, you know, that's like, if you're talking about it you're looking at the ends, the outcomes, judging the society by its outcomes. And I mean, if you want,
I might even reshare this tonight on stream, because it's so far is really good.
Probably more likely to institute that with either a kind of restricted representative system or even a dictatorship.
I mean, it's funny how even like
this would probably advocate.
Like,
but yeah, no.
One time, hold on, I got paused again. One time was just like, even Mao was just like, we're getting too fucking authoritarian over here. And it's interesting. It's just interesting hearing them both come together enough to agree that authoritarianism runs on a spectrum. And I mean, he's like, you know, the thing is, one time is like, you know, the thing is like when someone says authoritarian leftist, it's like I have to check myself, because it kind of offends me. It's like, am I an authoritarian leftist? And I'm sitting over here saying, well, you shouldn't want to be. Right. Oh. Well, honestly, I mean, honestly, I know a lot of Marxists will probably like totally get really offended by this comparison, but I honestly believe that the concepts of authoritarian communism are as oxymoron as anarcho-capitalists. I think that in true representation of the structures of communism, authoritarianism is antithetical, and it shouldn't be a tool that's used, just like capitalism can't be a tool used for anarchism. Like they're just too, that's antithetical. This shit don't mix. And, you know, it's just that we get, well, yeah, and then you get into this construct of how if you do use authority to develop your social society or socialist society, that authority, that dependency on authority is corruptible, and you're putting a lot of risk in allowing that authority to reimagine itself in how it preserves itself. And so right. Give up. There's what other way is there? Well, I mean, that's where it comes down to. You are an expert in that field, and part of anarchism isn't necessarily like using that expertise as an authority, but it's relying on that expertise as a voice on how things can be used. It's like you're not saying, oh, you know, we're going to be reliant on you to make this happen. It's, you are an expert in this field. What can you imagine to help us manifest this in the way that it needs to be done? And if people don't like it, they don't have to stick with it. Like they could literally choose something else. It's just the about. No. Right. Oh, right. Hey, karma. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that equitability is kind of like, I don't know, it's like a misguided target. It's not that shouldn't be the goal. Equitability shouldn't be the goal. Like, I don't know how I'm gonna finish that thought, but it seems like it's like things can be unequitable and still something that's needed for us to prevail. And we're still gonna have to figure out how to deal with that, you know, that difference. Oh shit. Almost made it back. Oh, what? I still lived! Ah! And it's like, I mean, it's like, equitability is different from equality, you know? And we want to be able to take away those things that require, we want to take away those things that make it so equitability is even necessary. Like, equitability almost in itself is a well, it's a confession that the circumstances aren't naturally equal, right? But that's what we want to do, is we want to be able to create that equal foundation. We don't want to have a foundation that requires us to balance it in order to make it work. We should have, like, our structure should at its core be equal without disruption. And it's kind of like that's, I mean, of course, in my opinion here, that's where a lot of things like how specifically land back plays into play of these things, because land back isn't just about one particular species, but all species, you know, and being able to create an equality for all living things rather than just the things that, you know, have that voice for a need. We can identify what things need, whether it can vocalize it or not. And, you know, it's like how, like, for example, how we have such a horrifying relationship with our food. Like, people think that, I mean, that not everyone, but there are people who think that it is ethical to be vegetarian and vegan because the harm that is caused by eating meat, you know, and farming. But I also believe, like, and there's some truth to that, like, absolutely. That's why it resonates with so many people. But I also believe that you can have a healthy relationship with food and meat in a way that you benefit their lives substantially, and you know, have loving the loving creatures that you share your energy with, and when the time is right, they share theirs with you, you know. And it doesn't have to be in a cruel way. It could be in a very harmonious way where, you know, I mean, shit, even the animal almost is like, you know, willing, because that's how our relationships operate, you know, where it's like the animal's at the end of its life. So of course it's just like, you know, ready to give back for everything it's been given. And that's the relationship that we should want with a lot of things, you know, not just food, but with a lot of things should be like that, where it's, you know, that consensual consensual benefit to preserve each other. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I won't deny that it is, it does seem very far from what we're at now, but it is something that we have been capable of in our past. So it's not something that's impossible to achieve. And I think that's a big part to kind of understand with that kind of concepts too, is it sounds fantastical. How can you have such a positive relationship with something you consume, right? That sounds, it doesn't sound like it's a realistic event, but yet it's something. Right, but that's something that has existed. Like, it's not like, you know, natives were enslaving their animals, you know, like they had a relationship with the buffalo. They didn't have to destroy them to live with them, and they prospered together in a really harmonious way, and they celebrated each other. So it's, you know, right. Well, and it, yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Right. Well, there's a certain degree behind that, some of that too, like, my ex always thinks that, the things I talk about are, they only work on a small scale. They would never be able to work on the global population. And, I think, well, my thought is like, well, first of all, that's a place that's unimaginative. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to be able to if you are willing to try to find a way to make things work, you can't just give up imagining the possibilities. But also, part of that land back structure is, being stewards, meaning that we all hold a degree of personal responsibility from what we take from the earth. Therefore, we hold a certain responsibility to what we give back to it. And that personal responsibility can come in any form. It's basically any form that we personally take, hobby in or joy in, because we all have, it's that same thing. There's a role for everybody. It's whatever your passions are. Your passion does have a place to help give back to what has been given to you. And, there's some degrees with technological and industrialization, and, a lot of those structures were developed, under the guise of, profit. So it is maximizing exploitation. When we're not seeing a system that is developed through, putting in as much as you take out. Right. Right. And when it should be an equal thing, it should be an equal exchange. We shouldn't be trying to take as much out of our environment as possible. That's where that's what's leading us to our climate demise, where the inevitable of revolutionary uprising is going to be based on how we've destroyed this planet, because it's going to affect more people than anything else that's ever happened before. And that mass affecting of people is what, that's the key. That's the core of revolution. People under bad circumstances. Right. Right. Because, comfort comfort develops complacency, you know, comfort, you know, it just makes people complacent to the situation. Well, at least it's not happening to me, you know. Right. Yeah, true. Oh. Shot. You have to. Oh, I know. It's because I'm in between tired and stoned and just meh. I had to get out of I had to drive up the hill to get out of my house in like 6 inches of snow. And it's not. I told her I might not be able to get up that hill by myself. So it's possible that I won't be able to pick her up. Because it took all of us as a family working together to get us up the hill. And it's supposed to snow more. I did shovel sidewalks, but out there, oh my god, it's just ridiculous. There's a lot of snow. No, yeah, no, there's not enough. Not enough. It sucks. Yeah, it's like, I mean, I wish I even had the money to just afford the salt. If I could just afford whatever fucking the $20 worth of salt it would take to salt that section of the road. But like, I mean, I wish the city would do it. It's like, it seems so ridiculous that there are so few hills in the city that the city can't just, you know, plow the few hills, the few, you know, roads that have hills. And it's like, the plow goes right by here. It doesn't make sense why it can't just take that one extra block. Especially when it's such a huge part to the neighborhood. Like this, my street is kind of like the beginning, you know, one of the main roads to go into the neighborhood. So it gets a lot of traffic. And you'll hear, yeah, that's right. It's because the poors live here. It's true. It's absolutely true. You'll yeah. Yeah, I'll hear cars revving at the bottom of the hill to get speed to try to bomb the hill. Try to get out of here. And it's just funny because I live like near the top of the hill. Just enough of the hill is above me that I can't get out. Fucking hills going up the hill. Everyone's done. Everyone's dodging my nunchaku. Aha! I like them when they hit. Yeah, I love them when they hit. I just don't like them when they hit me. Alright! Same team! Whoa, what happened? Did I get kicked? What? Game server error. At least it was server error, not you've been removed because you nunchaku'd someone too hard. Oh, I don't want that. I like the. I know he looks like an eggplant, but he's a black currant. Egg platypus, not. I mean egg currant. Oh, wait, currantipus. Platycurrant, and. I might share this tonight, but it's 2 hours and 30 minutes long, which is long. But it's a good, I mean... Dun-dun-dun-dun. Uh-oh, is that my headphones dying? But so far I liked it. I liked the beginning at least. I like hearing them. I like hearing a genuine interest from a Marxist to understand what anarchists want. And I also like hearing Marxists criticize some of the fallacies that Marxists kind of like fall under. I also like, that so far some of the criticisms expressed on anarchism are even legitimate, just like they were talking about the fake representation that is like ANCOMs, or not ANCOMs, ANCAPs, and I mean, the only I'm gonna say the only thing so far is the only thing that's kind of a bummer so far is that I mean, it's two white guys. What are you gonna expect? But there is no, indigenous insight on how a lot of these core ideas that make up, Marxism and anarchism are from indigenous origins, where they were a collaboration of both, and maybe I mean, there's still 2 more hours in this video. Maybe they get to it, but to me, I feel like that's something that should be mentioned right out the door, because it's like that should be a unifying point for a lot of anarchists and communists in the first place, is to identify that a lot of goals for both structures are damn near identical. We want the same things. It should, we should be able to collaborate on how to achieve those things better. Like collaboration should be more achievable simply because we have similar goals, and I think that it's a real I feel like more anarchists should be susceptible to accepting collective power, because I think a lot of anarchists don't understand that collective power often gets identified as state power, and that's not always. And I mean that's a thing too. Is I think a lot of I think both anarchists and communists need to address the concerns for each group. Like communists should be susceptible to accepting the worries anarchists have on incentivizing power, and I think that anarchists should take the concern of oh shit, I just dragged them in there with me. I think a lot of anarchists would do well to understand that collective power isn't an authoritative action, and I think that sometimes that those ideas get muddied because it's like. I mean, it's not all anarchists. I mean, a lot of anarchists get this concept. It's same with Marxists. You know, it's. I think it's just as a core, a widening concept that we should be listening to each other's concerns rather than arguing over the differences. The concerns are legitimate. The concerns anarchists have over state power and collectivizing power is legitimate. That we've seen time and time again. You know, and at the same time, you know, we do have a current system that's heavily dependent on collectivizing our utility, and so we have to be able to work with that in order to achieve, you know, that independence from that collectivization, you know, because right now that collectivization is monopolized by capitalism. We want to take that collectivization and damn it, and you know, liberate it so that it serves us and then no longer need it to be collectivized. It can be released to the people who are doing the work to help fulfill it, because then, you know, then it's basically, you know, being that's what you would call seizing the means of production. You know, that's literally what that is, you know, taking it back and then distributing it for everyone to manifest it properly, and that usually includes the people who are the ones doing it. You know, it's like not everyone needs to make food, but the people who make food should have a good fucking opinion on how to do it best. You know, and same with and it's just that again, it goes to that point of the difference between expertise and authority. We're not talking about expertise being something that speaks for everyone. It's just something that can be used as the tool that we can listen to help fulfill the need in that equitable way. Oh, damn, I still stayed in. All right. Oh, shit, he kicked me. Ah, wait, I got bananas too. Don't worry, I'm gonna do banana mode now too, dude. Don't worry about me. Where's my bananas? I thought I had bananas. Oh. Oh. Oh no! I think I pissed off TikTok's algorithm. Oh, I did take 2 soups. Yeah. Who? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. Right, right. Well, you know, one of I don't even know if I could say our friend anymore, but one of our friends hangs out there a lot. I mean, I can assume that that's probably a discussion. And I mean, funny enough, I was told that I was running a smear campaign by talking about them on my YouTube channel. And so I wasn't, even though I wasn't really, funny enough, I had a few people look at the VOD to see what I had said that was bad, because, like, you know, I admitted that I said things that I typically wouldn't, and I don't approve of it, and I apologized. But that apology was insufficient, I guess. And so, you know, I just wanted to, like, I was like, okay, well, other people wanted to know how bad it was, so I shared. I mean, I even took down the VOD. I was like, look, I didn't mean to fucking say that shit. I mean, of course, I'm going through shit. So I'm saying shit, and it's not a justification. I'm saying, oh, okay, no, don't, you don't need to say anything else. I agree. That's what was frustrating me, was just like, I was, well, well, it's like, I mean, I was just like, well, I mean, I wish I had the soundbite. I kind of want to make the soundbite now, but it's just like a child who walks into a movie. Fucking Donnie. It's like, no, I mean, I love them, okay? I'm not trying to say bad things about them. All I'm saying is that some people really don't have the patience to... They want to find out what's happening right now, and then they don't realize that sometimes that comes with a long... that comes with a prequel, you know? Oh. What the fuck? Right. And so and it's like, you know, I mean, I won't deny that I acted out of hand. I showed pictures to show people what the harm was doing to me, because I wanted to make it clear that everyone was being really fucking selfish in my space and not fucking taking into consideration that I'm going through shit. And I mean, but of course, that went right over everyone's head. That's me trying to center everything about me. But it's like, hey, you could have done all of this in DMs. This was all smeared all across my fucking community, which I don't... Yeah, you know, it's like... You know... I know you weren't. I didn't think you were. Yeah. I did. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. I don't. Oh no! And yeah. And I'd like to think that I tried my best to diffuse and lay out my expectations. You know what I mean? I was like, look, we can't be doing this like this. We can't be doing this like this. If you fucking respect me, you should do this and you should do this. You know, and it's just I tried my best to like just lay it out of what could be done for me. And I hate I mean what made me what literally made me break down was the fact that no one wanted to honor my wishes. And it was like, so why first of all, why are you all mods here if you can't even honor my wishes? And second, why am I raising money for y'all? Like, I can barely raise money for myself. And I'm still trying to organize a mutual aid to help everyone, and yet they can't even stop bickering at each other. No. No. Right. Yeah, yeah. Hold on, I gotta mute this.
You deal with that question with regarding the possibility of people wanting something that, might not be progressive or might not be good.
Yeah, no, I think this is like a worthwhile question, and it's reasonable that anybody should have a lot of thoughts on this topic, right? But it's also one that's very difficult to answer kind of succinctly. First, I would just like to say that insofar as that we are worried about establishing a system where xenophobia is institutionalized and it's carried out in mass, I feel like we already have pretty strong examples that authoritarian or hierarchical systems are not good preventatives, right? Like, I mean, we're living on a planet where every single state on Earth is a hierarchical power structure, and most of these states are moving more and more towards xenophobia. So this has always been kind of, for me, one of the kind of humorous things about Plato's old problem with the problem of the demagogue in democracy. Is it's like, there's always this conception that the demagogue is going to get empowered by direct democracy, and the will of the people is going to be negative, and that it's going to lead to all these negative problems. And I look at hierarchical systems and I see where we just have systems that already empower demagogues. All of these systems continually empower demagogues anyway. People are still voting for all these people into these power structures. Yes, these power structures have limitations, but as we can see, those limitations are kind of papered over by the power dynamics of these various systems, So that's just like one thing, is just to note that I don't think hierarchical power structures are proving themselves particularly good at controlling this problem of the masses and xenophobia. If anything, I think that they gin it up even more. They perpetuate these xenophobic us and other mentalities. That's like the first part I want to know, which is just to say I don't think hierarchical power structures are doing a very good job addressing it themselves. But I'll play defense nonetheless, right? Like I'll just explain for my own sake my conception of how an anarchist society is meant to deal with these problems. First, I'll just note no system is perfect. Obviously, every system will have flaws. Every system will have ways that it might degenerate into something negative. Every system, in my view, contains the seeds of its own destruction. That's just natural to every system. So anarchism will have flaws and it will make mistakes. I can guarantee it. However, the internal structural protections that you might do, for example, we can look at Rojava. So Rojava has what are like minority councils. So yes, they're making a lot of decisions through direct democracy, but if those decisions, say, bear on women, they bear on ethnic minorities, they bear on religious minorities, there are councils, literal women's councils, ethnic councils for different kinds of people. Say the Assyrians are one that a lot of people note. Religious councils. These come in when those sorts of issues are being decided on, and they have the power to intervene in that discussion, to offer amendments, to even veto the process in certain occasions to prevent those sort of negative things from taking place. So that's one solution. You create these sort of minority protections through minority councils. And that one is, I don't know, I can see that one still having some significant flaws. I imagine over a long enough time scale, it might go wrong. But
I've heard, I'm not an expert on Rojava, so you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard they're like, you know, there's a lot of xenophobia in the Kurdish community in Rojava. And, you know, I mean, you could say part of that's historical because they've always been treated a lot like how Jewish people are treated, you know, never really given their own land and persecuted. But I have heard that they have a xenophobia of their own. I've heard this from this is not evidence-based. So, you know, this is not like a hard argument or anything, but I've heard this a lot from Iraqis and Syrians. I don't know if that's a biased perspective I'm hearing, but
no, I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily disagree. But what I would note is that, because I don't want to get too bogged down in that particular example, I think there's a much better answer to the question, but I just want that one to be kind of there for us to see that there are a variety of solutions. But I will say, given that they actually do have that xenophobia, the fact that those councils exist and they've done such a good job of suppressing this sort of structural imposition of xenophobia is actually a good indicator that it works. Assyrians have protection within Rojavan society. There was a point where there were stipulations being passed by the councils that appeared to be discriminatory against Assyrians, and it ultimately got overturned because those Assyrians actually do have that form of representation. They were actually able to get some forms of cultural protection against that form of institutionalized xenophobia that we might be worried about. So the councils do appear to kind of work. In fact, they work really well for women's issues in that same way. You know, you might say the Kurds as well have had a historical problem with patriarchy, but the women's councils have actually done a really good job of holding that patriarchy at bay. So I'm just saying that this is one set of solutions. And it actually does seem to have some indications that it works, even against a tide of cultural xenophobia, against a tide of cultural patriarchy. It's still doing a good job at holding those things at bay within society, not allowing those impulses to overpower the needs of minorities, to offer sort of minority protections. For my own sake, I think that a better way to think of it is understanding scales of confederation and what the points of unity or protections are within their charters. So in anarchism, we have this concept of those who are affected decide. So that is to say, when decisions are being made, those who are affected are the people who are brought into the conversation to make those decisions. And when we are talking about human rights, that is something that affects everyone. So the things that affect every single human being, their right to eat, their right to live a dignified life, their right to shelter, all of those things, those affect all humans. And so in my mind, that means that that is going to be stipulated in the largest scale federated charter. That is going to be in the global charter if our federation has gotten that large, or a continental charter if that's how big our federation is. Those protections are at the basis of the federations themselves. So if you are associated with the federation, you've already agreed that people deserve those baseline things. And then you can imagine that when you get more and more local, you're dealing with more and more specific conditional things. You know, the example I've given a lot in order to kind of discern the difference here is if I'm just deciding, for example, in a neighborhood, how wide the streets are or what time the street lights go off, that really only affects the people there in the neighborhood, right? And so by the stipulation of those who are affected decide, the people in the neighborhood are the ones that make that decision about the width of the roads and the time that the street lights go off. but they don't get to make a decision about the fundamental rights that human beings deserve, because that is not something that is within the direct purview of that neighborhood. That is something that is within the direct purview of all of humanity. And so it would have to go through layers and layers and layers and layers of direct democratic consensus. It would have to literally pass through this iterative consensus process at the scale of continents or globes for that to be acceptable. And then we might imagine some people bring it up, they're like, okay, well, so what? What if they do it anyway, right? What if they do it anyway? What if they just decide they're gonna do it anyway? Well, that is the purpose of disassociation and escalating sanctions. So you start with the lowest level form of intervention, where maybe it's literally just talking with the people and like trying to convince them not to do this, as well as reminding them of possible consequences. And the sanctions would escalate, and those sanctions would be involved. Those sanctions would largely be predicated around this concept of disassociating from the Federation. So if, for example, you want to carry out a pogrom, if you want to go and lynch a bunch of black people or do something terrible in that sense, right? You would, in effect, be disassociating from this continental or global federation. And that federation determines the distribution of basic human necessities. It determines the distribution of food. It determines the distribution of shelter. So if you want to have a pogrom, you're going to need to fuck off to the wilderness and do everything by yourself now, because now you've disassociated from a federation that determines the distribution of all things. And I know that was a lengthy answer, but I think you can tell just from the substance of this answer that there is a huge amount of detail and complexity to this topic.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think, well, part of the answer kind of, I think, jumped the gun a little bit, because, you know, you kind of transition to a hypothetical world of global anarchism in which there already are federations. I mean, even to have federations at a at a scale that would be as big as a country, it would already be a massive undertaking. That would be kind of unprecedented, right? Like probably closest I've heard of that even happening would probably be Catalonia, being like federation of different anarchist groups coming together to form a sort of, some people might call it as a hyper-democratic state, or just, a confederation, a non-state. I guess the term you use it is less important than the substance, in my opinion, of what it is. But the, objection, I think, immediately people would say to that is that anarchism has historically been highly local in nature in the times it's ever really occurred. I've heard some anarchists, I've watched an Andrewism video, I think, where he said yeah, of course, anarchism is kind of by its nature local. And, you have the ideas, you have different local anarchists, groups will kind of come together eventually. But, he even kind of concedes that like anarchism just tends to work more at a local level. You might disagree. I'll let you, give your answer to that. The thing is also just in terms of when it has occurred, it's been highly local, right? So the concern people have is that, if it's highly local, that means it's occurring likely in areas that are highly ethnically homogenous. And that's not just, to raise a concern of racism, but more so that, even though race is ultimately a construct and also culture, too, shared culture just does build a group solidarity. It's easier to have solidarity with groups, and, someone might say, well, maybe that's why it can work in a place like, for example, Chiapas, or it can, Chiapas is kind of complicated. I don't know, I wouldn't even say if it's really anarchist, maybe just libertarian socialist. Rojava, Catalonia, there's a sort of shared culture there, in which this is easier. It's easier to agree on things. It's easier to be this democratic if you have a shared group solidarity. How could this possibly work within outgroups? I mean, once you get outgroups, how are you going to get a confederation of where like these democratic groups can all work together, where that, group solidarity might not, hold in the same way it does with people in the shared group? That's kind of, I think, a question people would raise.
Yeah, well, I'll say, I really like Andrew and I really like his content, but me and him definitely differ on this topic about this organization, formality of organization, scale of organization. I am much more pro-organizational, to the degree I think that we should be aiming towards the nested federation up to the scale of the planet. I definitely do not take the position that all we're trying to do is create a bunch of like these little, provincial local councils that only deal with their immediate affairs. I definitely think that part and parcel of an anarchist revolution has to be federation at larger and larger scales, and the development of long-term institutions as well. So that's one part of the answer I would give. But I would also note that insofar as we're talking about creating federations and then being larger and larger, historically, anarchists actually have created international federations of organizations like that. That used to be very commonplace before basically the end of World War II, where we started to see a resurgence of more individualist or anti-organizationalist anarchism. Anarchism used to have the default conception of sort of this pro-organizational approach, what we might call social anarchism by contrast. And it should be noted, for example, the First International was largely, they didn't call themselves anarchists at that point, but they called themselves federalists. This was actually one of the first names that the anarchists used for themselves, precisely because of this principle of federalism, or confederalism, I guess we're discussing right now. This principle.
Yeah, not to be confused with Hamilton and Madison.
It makes that, God, it gets so muddy with that terminology that it's really hard to convey that to people sometimes. And this word federation or federalism more broadly also confuses people. I guess I'll just say here, confederation and federation, these words were just completely synonymous for a long time. I don't know why, but there was a split, I think, because of the United States and the way that those words were being used in the United States and the context of the American Civil War and the fact that the, Confederates were calling themselves Confederates, right? And so then we have this sort of conceptual distinction now between a confederation and a federation, but historically that wasn't an important distinction. And so federalism was literally pretty much just laying out what I told you about this concept of nested structures that get bigger and bigger, have varying charters of requirements, each of them having disassociation and escalating sanctions and so on. This was just kind of the default assumption of the anarchist movement about how this would be dealt with. For the majority of the time, it was a revolutionary movement. And so the First International was almost like the culmination of this concept of this sort of federative principle within anarchism. And it should be said that when you go research the First International, that was the dominant conception. That was the dominant socialist conception at the time. There was all kinds of infighting and all that sort of like historically legendary infighting at the First International. Yes, unfortunate, but that's all, that's a separate story, trying not to go down that rabbit hole. But anarchists for the longest time have defaulted to this conception of the federative principle. So I just want to at least get that out of the way, right? A lot of the misconceptions people have about anarchism is because they're encountering what I might call individualist anarchism or anti-organizational anarchism, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, really only beginning to arise in a serious fashion starting in about the 60s or 70s. And its sort of high watermark was like the 90s and early 2000s. And now we're seeing this movement back towards a social anarchism and organizational anarchism, which is much more akin to the foundations of anarchism. That's one part. But then also you talked about culture, the importance of culture and homogeneity and so on. I actually agree in a pretty serious fashion that a shared culture is an important part of having a harmonious or a cooperative, a solidaric society. But I just want to note that that's not something that can only be achieved at the small scale. In fact, I think one of the reasons why the socialist movements were so successful in the past was that they developed this sort of international culture, and they developed it around the importance of the proletarian struggle. And there was this conscious development of a proletarian culture, which was unifying and which completely transcended national boundaries. And I think anarchism can do just the same thing with maybe what you might call an anti-hierarchical culture.
Interesting. I would actually disagree that there ever really was that big of a proletarian culture, in the sense that I think even the proletarian movements all took on their national characteristics in their different areas. And okay, so like I think the reason why people have this association with anarchism being localist in nature, is partially just due to the fact that that's kind of how it's manifested. Whether that's by how it must manifest is a different question. Like, must it be a localist phenomenon, or can it be, more internationalist? And, I'll let you elaborate more on how that could happen, because this is what my objection would be. And I'm curious how you respond to it. I kind of think anarchism by nature will always be a kind of fringe movement, at least for a very long time. Maybe it could expand more, but the reason why I see it as localist is because, one, it's a highly radical idea. By nature, highly radical ideas are kind of fringe and become minority positions, unless three cases. One, that fringe position is concomitant with an existing cultural practice. So, for example, let's say certain indigenous groups that might already have anarchist types of organization that's kind of familiar to them. That's not a radical idea to them. Or in Catalonia, for a long time, had democratic practices. I mean, it was kind of like the rogue area of the Spanish region, and they had it in their culture for a long time, right? And the second way that a fringe position could become hegemonic is a dictatorship, right? You kind of impose it on everybody. The third way, which I think is the hardest way, but the only other way I could see it, is like radical position pretending to not be radical, and that's the only way I could see it being embraced by the public in a sort of like, if it was democratically elected. But that's the thing about anarchism. I see it as kind of, it's going to be seen as so fringe that by nature it'll be very excluded to like a small area, And I saw this a lot with Mexico, because I know Mexico is a weird case because it's not, of course, Chiapas is not anarchist. They were a former sort of Maoist group that kind of became more libertarian socialist in how they organized, more democratic.
Let me respond to that directly, because I'm going to respond to everything else, but specifically only the EZLN, which is just the vanguard. That's only a few thousand people. Chiapas itself is just an indigenous region that really doesn't have a strong connection to any of these radical ideas, and that's about 300,000 people.
Right, yeah. It's like saying that, the Bolsheviks controlled Russia. It's like saying the people were Bolsheviks. It's like, no, the people control, like, at the vanguard of the movement. The sort of point there is that, like, by nature, I think ideas that are perceived to be highly radical are going to kind of stay in the fringes unless they find a way to kind of impose themselves, or they kind of conceal their radicality, or if they are, like, they synchronize with an existing cultural practice. So that's why I don't really, for me, it's really hard to possibly see how anarchism could evolve into this like global confederation, maybe in a many years, but then we're talking about, to even get to that scale, you're going to have so much forces of reaction, you're going to have so much civil wars, which you seem to acknowledge in all of your videos. You're very realist about, like, the conflicts that would have to emerge and all of that. But yeah, I'll let you answer to this general objection.
Well, I actually agree with the foundations of your skepticism there, which is that it is a radical idea, and that means that it will take effort in order to proliferate. But I'm going to try not to ramble. I have a lot I want to say about this. I'm going to try my absolute best to keep everything succinct. First thing I want to say is that revolutions are fundamentally predicated upon the proliferation of an idea which appears radical beforehand. So there was a time when the concept of a republic was associated with chaos. Okay, so the vast majority of people viewed a republic as something that brought about chaos, and that monarchy or having, a nobility, that's what maintained stability. Yet, we all know that didn't last, right? Like, a time there was the proliferation of radical republicanism, revolutionary republicanism. And in fact, you can find that many socialists were influenced by how this proliferation of radical Republican ideals took place. Many of them actually called themselves revolutionary Republicans at the beginning of the socialist Republican era in the early 1900s and even through the middle 1800s, early 1800s through the middle 1800s. You had a lot of them still calling themselves revolutionary Republicans, because they were looking at this as being the sort of radical ideal and had already itself proliferated into society and had spurred into all of these revolutions which had overthrown various societies. But what I'd like to note is that this takes place through a gradual process of, number one, proliferating the ideas themselves, but that's not enough. It has to also come along with the development of a material base. So when you're looking at the development of revolutionary republicanism, it correlates with the development of capitalism. So capitalism developed, I would probably say that it began in the 1600s.
Is the term I would use, but that's a technical probably difference.
Yeah.
I see bourgeois society and capitalism as separate phases. I don't think capitalism started until the Industrial Revolution and the enclosures and then the Industrial Revolution. But like bourgeois society, market societies, you might call it, emerged, since the Renaissance.
Yeah, here we see why many theorists call this embryonic capitalism or the embryo of capitalism and so on. But I'm basically just saying that capitalism prefigured itself, this phrase prefiguration, it's about building the new society within the society you've currently got. So capitalists began doing that in like the 1500s and 1600s in a really serious way. And that began to blow up into something really significant, such that you basically had a strong capitalist material base, to where it wasn't just a revolution of radical ideas. It was essentially now a revolution. The ideas now correlated to a development in reality, a development of structures, right?
And a whole class capable of carrying it out.
Precisely.
Like the middle sort, the bourgeoisie, who at the time was the middle sort.
Yeah, exactly. It was a developing merchant class, essentially. So when we now look at the socialist revolutions, what their argument was, okay, well, the proletarian is a class, or the proletariat are themselves constitute a class. And so what we see is that the development of those material structures were unions and federations of unions and so on. That was that material base now. They were developing that material base, and along with it, they were developing these radical socialist ideals. And this process is what developed enormous scale radicalization of people, the development of these early revolutionary potentials. It is that embryonic development. It is the parallel to that embryonic development of the capitalists, right? Well, anarchists are just advocating a very similar thing here. They're basically saying we're going to have to build structures from the bottom up. We're not saying that we're going to get everybody to agree with it, then we're going to put it all in place. We build it here and now, right? We have to build those structures. We have to build the councils. We have to build the direct means of empowering people. We have to build general assemblies. We have to build federations of all of these organizations, build workers' cooperatives, build mutual aid networks, build all of that stuff. And that's that development of a material base, which represents horizontalism. And at the same time, we are proliferating the radical ideology that also correlates to that material development. So I think this is where you get the importance of the concept of prefiguration, which I kind of talked about just a moment ago. But prefiguration, once again, is building the new in the shell of the old. It's about creating those structures that form the basis of the next society within the society you're currently in. And I think that this comes back to, I'm not saying this is you, but there's a common misunderstanding of anarchists that they're just saying, you're going to do a coup and then you're going to press the communism button, right? Like I've heard people literally characterize anarchists as believing that before. It's not the case at all. Anarchists believe in a gradual process of development where these alternative structures become more and more powerful until they form this material base that then brings about a possible conflict with the society as it is.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a straw man people use. I think more so when the spirit of what they're kind of attacking when they say stuff like that, or what they mean to attack, because they're using a kind of straw man. But I think the real objection underneath there is that anarchists believe that you shouldn't seize the state power. Basically, you need to kind of do all this without state power. This is where I would disagree, just because I think the state is what's going to ultimately repress all of this from happening. Like it's what would stop it. So like you need to the state power it's powerful not just as a way to, it's not only like powerful at suppressing revolutionary activity, but it's also very crucial to instituting, provisioning a new social order. Like I don't think, to me, capitalism didn't really even happen until the enclosures, because by the time the enclosures happen is when the bourgeoisie is the dominant force in parliament. And when they have the state power to institute their will, they essentially create the laws that pretty much make it so that like peasants have to become proletarianized. I mean, this is what the enclosures are all about, right? And I think like, I see the transition to capitalism as is requiring that provisioning of legal code. I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying, that you need to build these structures beforehand. You need to build communistic structures, because you need development of civil society. You need structures outside of the state. I'm all for that. And also, to make these ideas not seem so alien to the general public, you kind of need to normalize them through this process of prefiguration. But, ultimately, I think like in order to transition a large degree of capitalist enterprises to socialist ones, it's going to be a change in the legal code. And who has a monopoly on the legal code? It's the state. I mean, the state and it's essentially monopoly on violence is what has a monopoly by extension on a legal code that it can enforce. And I think that will be necessary to, for example, transition like the stock market into worker ownership. Like that would be, you could change actually, I wouldn't say overnight, but you could change pretty fast through simple changes in legal code. I mean, a lot of it, this is what it boils down to. It's like ownership rights. And yeah, I mean, like I understand the objection of seizing state power because, this monopoly on violence can be abused. But I mean, there's, that monopoly will be used against socialists. And I feel like inevitably socialists are going to have to somehow have that in order to make the changes they want. And the best we can do is limit that power from becoming tyrannical and totalitarian. That's my position. If you feel free to object.
Yeah, I have a few objections, but they're kind of subtle objections. So I think it kind of informs the split here. First of all, let me say that I think the important thing about this development of bourgeois power is that by the time that we're talking about involvement with the state, they're already incredibly powerful, right? They're already so powerful, they basically have the state under their control. They're essentially a superior force, such that the state kind of has to just cave to what they want. Like they've essentially infiltrated the parliament completely just by de facto reality that they have that much economic control. They've prefigured so much of a capitalist order already that it's almost just like, well, now it's kind of a bygone conclusion that they're going to force the state to do what they want. They've got the power, right?
And that's kind of how Kautsky envisioned the transition to socialism, by the way.
Yeah, understood. And I understand a lot of people kind of look at it that way. For my own part, I'll say this. It's not that the way that the state changes the legal structures and the legislation that it passes and the regulations that it determines won't have any effect on revolution. They will. And precisely in the way you say that monopoly on violence is 100% going to be used against the forces of revolutionary development. But one thing I want to note is that it's not actually just a binary on-off switch. It's not just a, do they choose to repress it, it's destroyed, and like, it's not just that simple in that sense. So one example I want to give for the kind of the working through the complexities here is we have FEJUVE in Bolivia. FEJUVE is essentially a federation of councils, of like assemblies, that essentially took over the administration of the entire city of El Alto in Bolivia. And it currently exists, actually. It basically arose because the state wasn't doing what it needed to do. It was not provisioning services properly. It was not giving people any sort of protection. It was very distant and incompetent. And so these workers' councils seized that vacuum. Okay, and then they essentially now organize and administrate the entire city. It's not to say that there is no, regional government associated with the Bolivian government. There is, but it is certainly not the thing making decisions in El Alto. El Alto is essentially practically administrated by FEJUVE at this point. So what happened was the state saw this happening, obviously seeing it kind of as a threat, and then began to become more present. But in that process, now it is not the superior power. This alternative power structure, FEJUVE is developed so thoroughly, they can't just come in and destroy it at a whim. It's not that simple. It's a city of 1 million people that have been inculcated in this alternative dual power structure, which existed beforehand. And so the state now is in that inferior position where it has to now kind of cave to what FEJUVE wants to do. FEJUVE has the power to get together mass protests. FEJUVE is integrated with a bunch of trade unions and federations of trade unions. Essentially, once you've got this superior power, then yeah, I mean, now you've got leverage over the state. I mean, if the state is needed and you need it to do something under your whim, then yeah, you get it to do something. But insofar as my concern is that I think people get this order completely reversed, okay? What they do is they say, oh, we need to infiltrate the state. We need to get people into the state. That will get us power. Then that power will protect us. But that's generally not what history shows takes place. What history shows takes place is that when people get really obsessed with parliamentarianism, they get eaten by the system. The state consumes those political actors. Those political actors now just become state actors. So trying to reverse the order where you start with parliamentarianism instead of the development of a movement that has superior leverage over the state is just going to take all of your radicals, all your revolutionaries, and they are going to get absorbed by the state. They are going to end up being actors that perpetuate the current state and not an alternative state. That if you're going to do that parliamentarianism, it needs to be as a result of you already having so much cultural preeminence, so much dual power, that it's like just a bygone conclusion. Of course you have power. Like, of course you're going to have people in the state. Some people are going to run. You've already got the culture. When they go to vote, who are they going to vote for? They're not going to vote for the person who is of a government they don't support. They're going to vote for the dude who represents all your dual power structures. But I find that people get that order completely backwards. For me, I'm not interested in that parliamentarian aspect. But I will say that for anybody that is interested in that parliamentarian aspect, you shouldn't be a parliamentarian. I know that's a weird thing to say, but if you care about the development of that parliamentarian power or that state power, you should reverse the order. Focus your mind completely on the development of that dual power outside of the state. Make it get so powerful that it has leverage over the state, and you'll find that it's just a bygone conclusion that your people will end up populating the parliament. That's my position.
Yeah, so I agree with much of what you're saying, and I think that is not a lot of Marxists traditionally wouldn't object to that. I mean, the concept of dual power isn't like that you take the state and then everything will just happen. I mean, to even get to that position, you need to build power in civil society. And if we're to use the bourgeois revolutions and the development of liberal capitalism as a sort of comparison, I would say that, the emergence of capitalism and bourgeois parliamentarism kind of went hand in hand. I mean, like, as the bourgeoisie got more of a force culturally and economically, they, had more influence in parliament. I mean, it was kind of going hand in hand. And to me, that's kind of why I do see like social democracy almost as the kind of stepping stone to socialism, because, to even like think of having like a powerful mass movement like that, it needs to at least be capable of legitimizing itself on a state level. It needs to be able to kind of be considered legitimate. Now, there's obviously forces of reaction. I view neoliberalism fundamentally as a kind of attempt to sort of walk back all of the progress that was made by social democracy. And if you read like Hayek, for example, in The Road to Serfdom, his precise fear of social democracy is that it'll lead to socialism. It's honestly quite fascinating to read him, because, he thinks that, yeah, once you have like the workers feel empowered that they can, get concessions like that, and that they can win the concessions, and that you have a powerful labor movement, they'll just demand more and more and more, and then they'll just have socialism, and the state will have tyranny over the liberty of private business. So, I mean, yeah, I guess that's sort of how I see it. So I don't think it's like necessarily to be juxtaposed. I wouldn't reject parliamentarism, especially because the only circumstance in which I would reject parliamentarism is a system in which nobody, or at least most people, don't view the process as very legitimate. So precisely maybe like Putin's Russia, for example. In Putin's Russia, their fake democracy is not really seen as legitimate by most Russians. You kind of have like puppets, opposition, people know that it's like not a real democracy. I don't think America is democratic either, but the thing is people still view the American system, for example, as like democratic to an extent. When there's instances in which the process by which people can win power democratically is clearly shown that that's impossible, which in America, I think, unfortunately, probably is. Just because the American system is very unique as a bourgeois democracy in the sense that it's, there's virtually zero possibility for two-party competition. And for a multi-party competition, and as a highly unrepresentative structure. So I think, like, let's say you had a Bernie Sanders attempt to build Democrats into Labor Party, in which, yes, he did have more support than Biden. And if that was shut down, I mean, now that would build that would like delegitimize the system in such a way that where people would be like, well, yeah, well, of course now I'm going to go seek extrajudicial means. Whereas if people see the state process as legitimate, they're going to see attempts to build revolutionary organizations outside of it as illegitimate. And that's kind of why I think one of the many reasons, there's many reasons why I think socialist movements haven't succeeded all that well in first world countries, aside from, being rich is one factor. But I think another factor is that in countries where it's seen as, the process is seen as legitimate, people are less likely to kind of take a revolutionary road. And I think until it's seen as less legitimate, you need to kind of at least build organizations that do try to legitimize itself at the parliamentary level while also building power outside of it. I agree with you, though, that it's not great to like waste all of one's time trying to get politicians elected. So I would maybe actually take the same position as you when critiquing the DSA's, overly focused approach on just trying to get AOC elected many times and thinking that's like what the pinnacle of progress is. Because America just lacks that movement, lacks that mass labor movement. But let's say like in the social democratic parties in Sweden and Denmark, for example, in Norway, before they were able to like share power at the parliamentary level, I mean, you had a labor movement to begin with, right? So it's like I totally agree, you need to actually build the movement first.
I think that's really the key aspect here. Personally, I think there's lots of stories. We could get off into tangents about what it looks like when you do it in a variety of different ways, and also the pitfalls of even being involved in parliamentarianism, even when you have a movement, for example, in the example of the CNTFAI. But instead, I think it's probably better we continue just inspecting this, right? Because what I see is that people have forgotten what happened in history. So, for example, a lot of people in the United States know about FDR, and they have kind of this like cultural memory through osmosis about FDR in the progressive era. And the way they look at it is like, oh, well, what we need to do is vote in another FDR. What we need is another progressive era. And so what we got to do is just vote in progressives, right? But what they don't know, or I guess maybe has been purposely sort of obscured in this history, is that was the result of an extremely powerful labor movement, right? Like the labor movement had been being built since the end of the Gilded Era in the United States. In the late 1800s, it had already begun being built. And by the time that you got around to the beginning of the Progressive Era in the early 1900s in the United States, the labor movement was really powerful. It was so powerful.
A crisis in the elite. You need a crisis in the ruling elite for it to even have the possibility of changing the structure. Like Roosevelt comes out also just because of the Great Depression.
Yes.
Which created a division in the elite.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that labor movement scared the shit out of the powerful. Like in the United States, that's the reason why they were doing almost everything in their power to crush it. And interestingly, by the time you get the progressives, by the time you get FDR, FDR is going to the elite, and what he's basically saying is, listen, I'm your best bet. Like, it's me or a revolution, right? Like, you need to make up your mind. And by the way, they didn't side with him. They tried to do a plot. They tried to do a coup. They tried to get Smedley Butler.
Parts of the elite. That's why I said there's a division in the elite. Like, parts of them really hated Roosevelt, but parts of them supported him. Like a lot of, progressive industrialists supported him, like, the car manufacturers, surprisingly, and oil companies, actually. It's a really weird, interesting fact. Like, he saved capitalism, that's for sure. I mean, he bragged about it.
Yeah, no,
but I don't think that put an end to the labor movement, if that's kind of what you're implying. I think actually after, with the legislation that came later under Truman, there was all this Cold War stuff that ended up being implemented, like the Taft-Hartley Act, which controlled labor unions, and were able to like purge labor unions and have them kind of controlled by the state. And, I that's a problem. But I mean, I would say honestly, like the Soviet projects did all that kind of stuff too. Like Lenin in many ways kind of had the unions all controlled by the state. And you already know this, you have a video on this. But.
Right. Yeah. No, but the thing is that I guess the difficulty here is that we now have a bunch of experimental data on this, right? So, we don't need to ideate too hard. We can kind of just look at the examples of when this has been done in the variety of ways it's been done. And unfortunately, what we see is that when you have an insurgent labor movement that then begins vesting a lot of its power in the, representative governance of the society that it's in, it feels like it's gaining power in that process. But weirdly, when you look back at the history and you really look at the details, what you find is that all of these kind of fiddly regulations and legislative acts that are passed have an effect of sort of de-radicalizing the revolutionary movement, of getting it sort of entangled in the effects of parliament. So for example, I was just talking with a friend of mine who's a Swedish socialist about this last night, and he was talking about in Sweden. So in Sweden, they essentially had, as we just discussed a minute ago, a very powerful revolutionary movement. Like, it was one of the most powerful in the entire region. And they essentially had two options.
Did you say a revolutionary movement or just labor movement?
It was a revolutionary movement. It was very powerful.
It's like, from what I've seen in not just Sweden, but also Denmark and Norway, is that it was more so a big labor movement, not necessarily all that revolutionary. Like, if anything, there's a lot of anti-communist sentiment in the movement because of like the fact that the Soviet Union was nearby and wasn't seen as a very great model.
Well, what you had was a split in the movement. So you essentially had two different positions, and this is what he was just talking to me about last night. You have one contingent of the movement that says we need to do revolution, and you have another contingent of the movement that says, no, what we need is universal suffrage. And I remember I was talking with him, I was like, universal suffrage? Like, that's an unusual dichotomy, And he's like, yeah, well, the conception is that if you made the state more democratic, then you could have mass control, and then your mass movement could use the state in order to slowly change into socialism, kind of as you were saying. And the movement chose the latter. They chose to push for universal suffrage instead of revolution at the height of their power. And that ended up being a mistake. It actually ended up killing the revolutionary movement. It ended up slowly absorbing that movement into parliament, such that now what it was doing was seeking the concessions in parliament instead of building that dual power, maintaining that leverage over the state. And that's sort of the big problem. When you get your power all tied up in the state, now you look to the state to maintain your legitimacy precisely in the way that you just said a minute ago. And that means that you slowly give away your leverage. And that leverage is precisely what allows you to treat the state as your vassal, I guess you might say, as an inferior that you get to dictate the terms to. Slowly, the state regains its power of legitimacy through your continued involvement.
So I think you're kind of mistaking cause and effect there, because those examples, when the movements were demanding suffrage, right? This is before the governments are seen as democratic. So it's not hard to see why a radical movement, after achieving quote unquote democracy, right, might de-radicalize in the sense that they think, oh, well, we have democracy now, we can do it, right? But the issue is that, revolution is not even really all that conceivable unless one, the conditions are so abysmal that people feel like they are willing to risk it, right? And two, if the state is seen as completely illegitimate, right? And the issue that we're in is whether we like it or not, most of us are living in countries that have perceived democratic legitimacy. And as a result, an attempt to kind of bypass that will only go so far. It'll be naturally very fringe. And to me, this is why like America's an interesting case, because I think America is a bourgeois democracy that could easily lose its legitimacy because I think it's among the least democratic. That's why I focus on it so much. And its failure to democratize might in many ways catalyze a kind of revolutionary movement. But until you have that like decline of legitimacy, though, I think that like the radical movements are going to only go so far. It's easy to point to radical movements before in states that were before like suffrage, because it wasn't clear to everybody that like having a peaceful parliamentary road was even possible, right? But the issue is whether we like it or not. Like, I mean, a lot of people just think that, and I mean, even if a lot of people don't really believe that we have true democracy. I mean, most people don't think we have really true democracy, but we act as if we have democracy to some level, right? Like people still like go out and vote. People still think that Trump is, voting against Trump is going to save democracy, right? So, kind of what I'm saying here is that like part of why I do see like you do need to participate in parliamentarism, not necessarily because that's the way you're going to win, but because that's the way you need to also legitimize yourself. I don't think that's necessarily going to pacify in nature. You also need that to literally just have exposure. I mean, a lot of movements will stay in the fringe until they're covered by the mainstream media. And how do you get covered by the mainstream media? You're kind of on the political scene. In Canada, what's really interesting is the way the far right has been kind of popularized. The guy who was kicked out of the Conservative Party, Maxime Bernier, he formed his new party called the People's Party. He's definitely like the most racist of like our party's leaders. And that guy basically formed his new party. And, for how poorly they were run and how dumb their leadership was, it's incredible how much they actually kind of succeeded in, because they were able to get enough public support to get platformed by the CBC and be in the debates. And what that ended up doing is that even though they didn't end up like winning, like, well, they won one seat once, then they lost that seat in the second election. But they ended up popularizing a lot of ideas that were not that common in Canada. Anti-immigrant ideas weren't popular for like the last 50 years, at least. The sentiment's very pervasive now. Part of it is due to material realities that have been happening, but also part of it is due to the fact it's kind of been normalized by that. Now, the way I see, like, what are the lessons for the radical left? I mean, maybe we do need, these kind of parliamentary figures to normalize socialist ideas. And then to a certain extent, I see the silver lining of Bernie Sanders. What was so important about him was not that he was going to win the presidency and institute socialism. It's that his very existence and popularity on the mainstream political scene was able to kind of normalize the word socialism for once and actually have like interest in it more than ever. Like after Bernie Sanders in 2016, the United States saw an unprecedented rise in people signing up for socialist organizations more than ever. I mean, like, that's huge. So that's like, for me, also the importance of parliamentarism is that, the general masses, the quote unquote normies, a lot of them aren't going to be seeking the kind of, they're not going to be watching channels like you and I. They're going to be kind of hearing about things from the news or some mainstream outlet. And what's the easiest access to be talked about is through the kind of mainstream political scene, right? And at least like I see that as a way to broaden the discussion so that if the parliamentarians fuck up or that they're suppressed, then there's a radical side people can join into. But you need at least that pipeline, so to speak. So I see like parliamentarism as very important. I'm very against kind of retreating from it. But at the same time, I think most people are better off just joining an organization instead of like trying to, canvass for AOC. You get my point here.
Yeah, I think I held basically this position for several years myself. I would say from about 2011 when I joined Occupy until a little after Bernie Sanders' second run. I think I kind of held a pretty similar position. But then I read a bunch of history of how this all went. And it severely disillusioned me to the effectiveness of this particular tactic. One thing I do want to say, just referring to something you were talking about with legitimacy, you know, in America, approval for our state is abysmally low. Abysmally. I just looked it up while we were talking. It is at 19%. Approval for Congress is at 19%.
It's like that in Canada too.
But that's kind of the point. That's not legitimacy.
Nothing to do with legitimacy, though. That's
it
the
kind
thing.
of does, though. We elected him.
So Fukuyama had a great point in End of History. I think all the leftists should read End of History because he's like the enemy you should study, Fukuyama. I think to study like the true ideologist of liberalism. And he makes some powerful points. He has in this chapter called The Weakness of Strong States, which is that the problem with dictatorships is that when they fuck up, because there's not a perceived legitimate democratic way in which authority is delegated, when that authority fucks up, people will throw them out. There'll be a military coup or some sort of revolution, or they'll have to rely on repressive hard power to stay in power. The problem is with these liberal democracies, right, is so long as people see the process by which authority is delegated as legitimate, people are just going to think that the solution is to rotate another new guy, no matter how poorly the polls are. So you pointed to how unpopular the government is. Yeah, but that's the thing. People still think like, okay, well, let's rotate the other guy. Let's rotate this guy. In Canada, Trudeau's approval rating is probably around that level too. But people think, oh, let's get Poilievre instead. And that sucks. I wish people didn't think that. But that's the issue is like, you can't just make people overnight. There needs to be a clear process by which the authority, that process is delegitimized. And I think Russia, for example, after when because he was kind of had a fake democracy that was convincing for a while. You know, he brought Medvedev. People thought it was a kind of like becoming a liberal democracy. At this point, no one in Russia thinks that the process by which authority is established is legitimate. Like, I think Russia is a very fragile society, much weaker than it looks. I think Russia could experience a revolution easier than like Canada or the United States.
Perhaps, but I don't think that our perception of legitimacy is as high as you think it is. You know, talking to people on a pretty regular basis, I think that the perception that things are rigged is extremely pervasive, and it's extremely pervasive on the left and the right. Although I think less pervasive among just sort of boilerplate liberal Democrats, but among
why they hate Trump kills that noble lie.
Yes, exactly. It's a big part of why they hate Trump, is because he sort of defames their entire institution, the institution that they're so attached to. But I also just want to say about this concept of doing the parliamentarianism at the same time as you do a mass movement. It's often been said, this sort of like walk and chew bubblegum approach, right? And I actually used to make this exact argument. I used to be the person who would say, well, we can do both and we need to do both. You know, it's a kind of, in a sense, it's a diversity of tactics. You know, that's the way I was looking at it. But what I've realized at this point in doing lots of organization on the ground is we aren't at this point like they were in history when we're looking at, say, the peak of the progressive era or the peak of the development of Swedish social democracy, or name an example. All of those came after decades of development. We're not in that place. We're not at the end of decades of development. We are actually like, if we're looking at the, you know, a historical parallel to where we're at, we're not in the early 1900s again. We're in the middle 1800s. We're in like the 1850s or the 1870s in terms of how developed our movement is, which is to say, we don't have a movement. It's barely even embryonic. We don't have any power whatsoever, let alone the power to split our attentions into building a mass movement and trying to get elected to Congress. Getting elected into Congress is an enormously energy depleting activity. It takes a huge amount of effort.
Especially in America. Like, America is the most, it's the most like managed democracy in the, of all the liberal democracies. That's why Wolin calls it inverted totalitarianism, right? It's like, at this point, it's like hardly distinguishable from a dictatorship, but it's just, you know, there's no dictator. It's like a dictatorship without a dictator. But, you know, the part of why I think it's so hard to build that movement that you're saying is precisely because of the laws against it. I mean, like neoliberalism was in large part the kind of authoritarian way to destroy the labor movement, one by militarizing the police to a crazy extent, and also just like creating a surveillance state that makes people more scared to rebel. And also having in America all sort of legislation that literally makes it illegal to strike. Like in some states in America, especially in the South, it's straight up illegal to call for a general strike. And, you know, in Canada, even in Ontario, we have right to work laws where, you know, the government can just basically say like, you know, you have to go back to work or we're sending the stormtroopers at you. Like part of why I think the labor movement is so hard to like reemerge. One, it's due to, I think, global, you know, deindustrialization as well as gigification of the economy. But in other parts, like, I mean, there's just a crazy state apparatus preventing it. And I think like if we democratize the state and had laws changed that would make it easier to organize, I think that would actually improve the movement, not hurt it. And I mean, I think we should take it from our greatest enemies. The greatest enemies are always afraid of like, you know, moderate center left governments because they think it'll open the door to like a more radical movement. I used to buy the idea that having the slightest social democratic or welfare state capitalist is what pacifies movements. You can see that in my video, Why Billionaires Prefer Democrats. You know, and it's to say why billionaires should prefer Democrats. But I thought that analysis was a little too US focused because in America, it's a little bit easy to use that as a way to kind of delegitimize the idea of working within parliamentarism because America doesn't have a labor party. You know, America just doesn't have like, you know, it's just one of the most least democratic systems in the world. Now, I don't think like, for example, in, you know, just having a labor party elected that might make it easier to organize will like pacify the movement necessarily, you know, and especially if, you know, what are you supposed to really do when it's so impossible to organize, you know, like legally speaking and in terms of a surveillance state. So I do think like, you know, if you have the legal changes that make it a little easier. I mean, yeah, I mean, like think about like if you had credit unions simply like laws that, you know, some of Corbyn's desired legislation, which would establish credit unions that would allow for more cooperatives, allow for more unions. That's a lot of power now given to civil society that could be used in the future.
One thing I want to note is that, so you named a list of things, one of them including a really repressive surveillance state. So, but you know, you said a repressive surveillance state, you know, a very aggressively dominating society, and also there being laws against these things. The first of those, I'll agree, they didn't have back then. They did not have as pervasive of a surveillance state. But the second two, they absolutely did have. They had an extremely violently repressive state in almost every occasion, and they had explicitly laws against groups of people getting together, not even forming unions.
Yeah, and when did organizing become more pervasive?
Well, this was in the 1800s when they had these laws.
No, that's the thing. In America, when they actually allowed unions, like they proliferated everywhere.
But they had laws against organization when the earliest unions were being developed. That's how the earliest unions developed, they were illegal unions. And they were being developed in a pervasive atmosphere wherein they were being denied, where there was legal denial of their right to do all of these things. And the only strikes they could do were basically wildcat strikes. And these wildcat strikes were still so powerful that they developed leverage over the state. So I just want to emphasize that laws against these forms of organization have historically not been enough to stop these forms of organization from developing pervasively. So I don't think that can be credited or the answer.
Is that when they allowed them to exist, you know, and that was won by the labor movement, that didn't stop the labor movement. It made the labor movement stronger. Because what I'm trying to push back against is the idea that like making things a little bit better makes the movement more tranquilized, and that if you make the system worse, you will by nature radicalize the movement. I feel like that's a kind of accelerationist assumption.
Yeah, I don't hold that position. But I will say that it is the case that when you have gotten lots of concessions from the state, you then begin to look to the state for your concessions rather than the development of your movement itself. And we see so many examples of this that it just can't be flat out denied. You know, we have to take a nuanced position on this where it can't just be said to be one extreme or the other. there are many occasions where using the state in order to verify the power of your movement leads to you being controlled by the state. So, for example, you said when they made it legal to build unions, it made the movement more powerful. Well, in a sense it did, but it actually led to less radical strikes. Just using the US as an example here. We had way more radical wildcat strikes when we weren't really allowed to do them and weren't allowed to form unions in that sense, and didn't have a bunch of strict laws about how you develop unions and when you're allowed to do a strike than afterwards. And in fact, that is verifiable. If you go and you look at when there were laws passed around when strikes could be done, how unions were formed, what the basic foundations for collective bargaining were in the United States, it severely de-radicalized our unions. It really was the mark of the beginning of the liberalization of American labor unions. And
what period specifically would you say, like time, like just date-wise, when the movement began to de-radicalize?
Sometime between the 1930s and 1950s is kind of the mark.
America specifically, or
yeah, I'm talking about America here. But you can see these examples in many different places.
Red Scare?
The Red Scare, yeah, 2 Red Scares were obviously a contributing factor to this. But I just want to point out that that was 2 Red Scares under a progressive government, right? We had that, the progressive era began in the 1900s, it began in the 1900s and went through the early really got going in the early 19 teens. And we had 2 Red Scares in the period between the 1900s and the 1940s. So clearly it wasn't even that getting into government stopped a repression campaign either. So it's like,
well, yeah, they're not communists. I mean, like the people who were anti-communists at the time anarchists were just as anti-communist as the social democrats were at that time.
I guess it depends on what you mean by communist, right? If you mean,
well, you know what I mean,
Bolshevik communist, you mean.
Yeah, well, the Red Scare was against Bolshevik, and then they used that as an excuse to kind of attack leftists in general. But
the first one was, we sometimes might call it the Black Scare. It was actually a massive repression campaign against anarchists. In fact, they passed something called the Anarchist Exclusion Act, so they were allowed to deport anarchists.
Are you talking about the after McKinley was shot?
Let's find out what it was. Anarchist Exclusion Act. There was one in 1903, and there was another one in 1908.
That was that period. That was after McKinley was shot. That makes sense. Because and then you got like the Labor Day and moved to. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But yeah, no. So the thing is, like, look, we're in a very different time where now, like, we have a surveillance state where the FBI could listen to this conversation we're having. And merely on the fact that one person, for example, let's say somebody hypothetically advocates radical action against the state, that is deemed illegal. I mean, that can now be used against you in court in a way that simply wasn't available back in the day. Like, part of why it was easier to organize back in the day was, like the state just didn't have as much power. I mean, like states have a crazy amount of power nowadays. Like I like to emphasize this, especially in the United States. I mean, it's getting bad everywhere, but in the United States, America is like China. It just, doesn't have to use that power it has yet. And imagine if it used all that NSA surveillance, which, we've shown through leaks that it has data on everybody and spies on people illegally. I mean, they could use that. And that's the kind of thing where I kind of think, like, even if you are like a hard radical, you have to at least pretend that you're within the system's deemed legitimate logic, even if you're not. You have to kind of be an anarchist in social democrat clothing, even if you're an anarchist, if that makes sense. Just because I see, like, that's why I say this to Marxist-Leninists as well. You can't be going around advocating revolution with a Lenin avatar. I mean, like, you're in a very lucky position right now where you're able to do that. But I mean, with one button, they could just take all that away. There's nothing you could do. That's why I'm such a free speech advocate, because I think we should try to like actually play on to the rights of like liberalism and make sure that the state adheres to those things as much as we can, because I mean, we're fucked if they don't. We should not take those freedoms for granted. I mean, like in China, try to find anyone who's a critic of the Chinese government online. I mean, their platform gets removed. It's why, it's hard to find. You can only see the only people who are representatives of the Chinese government you see are usually propagandists, if they're talking on like the platform. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't mean to downplay the strength of the American government. The American government is obviously one of the most horrifyingly powerful governments in human history. If not just clearly the most powerful government in human history. And its scale of suppression and, surveillance is completely unparalleled. There's nothing that could even be possibly compared in history besides modern states, like you said, like China or something. That being said, I don't take the position that just because they have the tools that they are absolutely powerful. I think that one thing we realize is that in all stages of history, power structures seek to portray themselves as infallible, but when they're actually placed under pressure, they fracture and stumble in a variety of different ways. I think that we were absolutely unprepared for the scale of COINTELPRO here in the United States. I think that we never really imagined that it could scale nearly as wide as it did, that they were doing the depth of infiltration and purposeful destruction that they were doing. I think we were caught completely off guard. I just don't think we were prepared for it at all. I do think that there are solutions, and the solutions are just hard. That's the truth. You have to develop what might be called an above ground, below ground approach, which is to say that you have an aspect of your organization that is above ground and is, aping all of the sort of aesthetics of legitimacy. And you have an aspect which is below ground, which is purposefully obscured, which does attempt to avoid surveillance, attempts to avoid purposeful actions of infiltration and destruction, such as repetitions of COINTELPRO. And I think that that's what we've seen has been happening in a variety of places on Earth, where I'm not going to say they're experiencing the same things as the United States, because it's, once again, it's just wildly out of control. But they are experiencing purposeful repression by their states. And this is pretty much what they do. You have some aspect which blends into civil society, and that's because it is trying to provision services for civil society. And you have an aspect which is below ground, which is illegible, which is not easy to suppress, which is not even easy to find by even the most sophisticated government surveillance. And you have to be very conscious of the sophistication of government surveillance. That being said, I don't want to downplay how bad it is. It's bad. But I also want to emphasize that every government tries to present itself as this, completely impenetrable, completely undefeatable thing, whereas history just doesn't show that that's the case.
I do think that, first of all, I would agree with your above ground, underground approach. I think that's wise of any organization. That's where a lot of communist parties operated back when, they were deemed illegal, right? But I think the fact that the United States doesn't need to use its hard power as much as it could is reflective of their power. And when it starts using the repressive power is an indication of when that power is declining. Because, true power is when people bend to their will no matter what. And I think people are bending to their will when, they're not, even, when they're pretty much operating exactly as, they would want them to operate. People are not gravitating to socialist ideas. And I don't know, I see that in America, it took so long for socialism to gain legitimacy again. It took such a while, and Sanders opening that door really was huge. What else is that but legitimacy? Because, when you have no one on the mainstream scene espousing such positions, it's crazy to, call yourself a socialist. The more it's destigmatized, I think, the more people can actually explore the pipeline of where they can, might see the inadequacies of parliamentarism and, build organizations outside. Because, I do see, we don't have to rehash the disagreement, but ultimately, I guess what it boils down to is I just think, you need that dual power approach. And I don't think it necessarily pacifies people. What pacifies people is material concessions in terms of pacifying the mass, I don't even think that's necessarily fully true. And if so, if we take that kind of immiseration thesis to its conclusion, it means that we would want conditions to get worse for people in order for the revolution to happen. And I don't know. I think that's a terrible idea. I think we're more likely to get fascism under any kind of immiseration based on the way things are going.
I would tend to agree. Once again, I think it's complex. It's contextual and complex.
In the way I see fascism fundamentally is I don't think what exists with Trump is fascism. I just think it's like authoritarianism, more of the same, like far right, capitalist authoritarianism. I see fascism as kind of what emerges in response to socialism's failure. When like socialist revolutions fail to take hold. It's kind of like the socialism for fools, fascism, right? It's like this collectivist, it has a socialist spirit to it, but it takes, instead of all of that ambition to, building a collective society for all, it's kind of a pseudo-collectivism for specific people, directed not against the ruling class, but directed against the non-people, whoever is excluded by that, right? So like, yeah, I don't know. I think like the worst conditions go. I don't see it as like going in a socialist direction in America at the moment, but like, I wonder in France, for example, like where they try to do their parliamentarism, and now Macron basically said no. Macron is like, no, you won the election. Oh, we're actually just not going to let you in power. We're just going to put the far right guys. I wonder if that will push the French into a more radical direction. I would hope it would, because like that to me is such a lack that should delegitimize the system.
I think that what this is kind of brings us back to the importance of developing the alternative structures, because I think that if the system becomes delegitimized, but there are not alternative structures, people aren't necessarily going to get outraged and up in arms. Sometimes they just become defeated, right? You can defeat populations of humans for centuries is what we can see from history, right? Like there are empires that reigned for centuries with hardly any revolts, even though the people hated it. There were miserable conditions, right? So I think that what really matters is that there is sort of an outlet for their energies, their desires for an alternative. And this kind of brings us back to, as the system fails, there have to be these really meaningful places for them to dump those energies. So using an example, because this kind of also offers some I don't know, not clarification, but it gives us some material to work with. So I'm with an organization called Cooperation Tulsa, and when Trump got elected, we got a huge flood of new members. We got a flood of people applying. We got a flood of new volunteers because they needed an outlet, right? So Trump got elected, things got bad, and then boom, they flooded into the outlets. But imagine there had been no outlets. Imagine that, everything had just been focused on electoralism, and now they're pissed about electoralism. They don't think it doesn't work, or they don't think it works, and there's no place for them to put that energy. They're probably just going to be defeated, right? They're just going to give up. They're just going to embrace nihilism. They're going to embrace hopelessness. And that's why, in my mind, 100% of my energy is always focused on developing these alternative structures. I actually just want to say, because, you brought up immiseration theory, and I do think that's kind of at the center of what's being discussed here. And we can kind of, or just for anybody listening, I don't know how familiar people are more broadly, but immiseration theory is the concept that as the conditions of people get worse, they develop a more radical or revolutionary class consciousness, which then pushes them towards revolution or revolt of some kind. This was very popular among the foundational leftist theorists. However, I agree with you that history hasn't really borne that out. History has not borne out that that's what happens. But it's important that as the immiseration takes place, we use this dissatisfied energy, we funnel this dissatisfied energy towards the creation of the alternatives that might one day develop to such a degree that they can have leverage. It also has to be said that these states aren't going to last forever. The United States is very powerful. It is still the global hegemon, but no state lasts forever. The United States will not last forever. It will, and perhaps is, experiencing decline. And as that happens, immiseration is going to get worse. the conditions of the United States, once again, we've been doing a lot of United States, but just using the United States as an example, as those conditions get worse, people are going to be pissed. You know, these are people that live in the imperial core. You know, as the state fails to prove its legitimacy in its ability to provision services, this is precisely where revolutionary movements need to be trying to emphasize and expand, because this is one of the unifying factors I've seen in everything I've ever studied in history. Where hierarchical power structures fail to provision the services they promise, that is the vacuum where our movements must expand. It's in precisely those places where they failed to give us what we need that we must provide for ourselves. And when that takes place, we develop the legitimacy of the alternative. And I think that's why I brought up Fehuve earlier.
This might get us into some other things I wanted to address, which are some critiques I have of anarchism, mainly due to the way I view history. I tend to have a different view of history than a lot of the way anarchists depict it. One is, you know, the state, because the objection of anarchists to the state is that it has a monopoly on violence. Now, to me, it is the state's monopoly on violence isn't, you know, unequivocally a bad thing. You know, it is a dialectical character. There's a consequence of that, right? The issue is that it can develop to such a degree where, you know, it can become super authoritarian and even totalitarian. But, you know, I see the state's emergence as kind of a way to, out of a evolution of essentially what were like balkanized mini-states before. And, you know, if you look at what we had before states, is like, you always had competition over territory, different groups competing over territory. And if you look at the evolution of states, I mean, it starts with, you know, tribes, then tribes form into clans. Clans sort of then compete for regional territory. And they're like almost proto mini states. In these sort of societies, there's a feature of a kind of in-group solidarity and out-group hostility, which they battle for each other. And, you know, of course, there's different kind of mini states, or if you want to call them that, like these mini so-called primitive societies throughout history. Some of them which were highly egalitarian, some of which were not. You know, and this is another difference I have is, you know, there's a kind of like anthropological argument that anarchists like to bring up in response to the human nature question, which is that, you know, well, historically many groups have been highly egalitarian and even communistic, right? And the thing what I feel like is missed about that is, yes, even though tons of indigenous groups have been highly egalitarian, what they miss is the kind of out-group hostility that still exists. While there is a kind of in-group solidarity, for example, the nations of the Americas, you know, tons of very fascinating history. I mean, you have some nations that are highly egalitarian, and then some who are highly hierarchical, like the Aztecs and Mayans, for example. But even the ones, you know, that are highly egalitarian, you know, even if there's egalitarian internally, there's a kind of authoritarianism towards the other groups, you know, like groups that are egalitarian internally might actually enslave another tribe, another group. And I see the state as the state as sort of unifies different tribes by imposing a kind of monopoly on violence, you know? And to me, it's not very clear that like, it's possible to really prevent, like, so like if you, let's just say the state withered away. You know, I don't believe in the Marxist theory of the state will wither away.
All right.
I don't believe in this at all, by the way. I think it's such a strange, poorly thought out idea. But like, because the idea, like, if you had no class, that the state would just wither away, to me, it's like, okay, well, then there's all these other hierarchies you have to deal with. But to me, like, the state also, like, without the state, I think you'll just get balkanization of mini states. And local states, even if we get like highly egalitarian local states, what's stopping them from like being highly authoritarian when conquering other groups? Because that's what we saw throughout history, you know? And that's, to me, like, I don't know, I have a more Hegelian view of the state, so that's where we disagree the hardest, is I kind of see an evolution of it. And the best we can do is try to make the most democratic state in which power is held accountable. You know, so I'm, I guess, more of a classical liberal in that regard, you know? Because, like, I look at history and I'm thinking, like, when has we ever really had, like, stateless, classless societies? I mean, we do, right, in tons of local contexts, but what ends up happening is that another of those societies ends up conquering another society. So it's like, all right, is that good? I don't know. I'm for like, the human progression. So I know I'm curious how you answer these sort of questions.
Well, I would not disagree with the idea that even some of these egalitarian societies were warlike. In fact, I think this is something that often doesn't get discussed, but I think that the solution is confederation, or is federation, as we've discussed, right? It is bonding them together into these charters that they all agree to. For me, that is the key solution, and we can see it really played out in the Iroquois Confederation in the United States. I don't know how familiar you are with that. Are you familiar with the Iroquois?
Vaguely, yes. I mean, because Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about the Iroquois in her book, Indigenous Peoples, History of America, which I've been finishing up. But yeah, there are also examples she gives of an egalitarian group that was kind of, though, a little hostile to other groups, like very authoritarian to other groups, but very democratic internally.
Yes, but they had been warlike towards one another before they developed the Confederation, right? The Confederation is what maintained those peaceful relations among those egalitarian but warlike tribes. And what ended up happening was you developed something which was extremely robust, something that was more than the sum of its parts, something that practiced complementarity, where all at once all of that internal conflict started to disappear. That's not to say that the Iroquois Confederation itself was not necessarily warlike with other surrounding